Amen. Well, let's go to 2 Kings chapter 17. 2 Kings chapter 17 is the closing chapter, if you will, on the 10 northern tribes of Israel. It's in 2 Kings 17 that the northern tribes are carried away, and they are still gone. They were the 10 lost tribes of Israel here in 2 Kings 17, about 722 BC, and they are still the 10 lost tribes, which makes the promise, and there's a number of these promises all over the Bible, that God is going to regather Israel. It makes the promise of the hope to them as real as our hope is to us. And then in the last 9 chapters of Ezekiel 40 to 48, God, one of the things he does is he shows how the tribes are going to be redistributed in Christ's millennial kingdom. So God will bring back the people, raise them from the dead, bring them back to Israel, and they will occupy the land. So if we go to 2 Kings chapter 17, verse 1, there's an overarching theme here about the consequence for long-term sin. And then there's a whole bunch of mini lessons that go on. So for example, as we start in 2 Kings chapter 17, it says, in the 12th year of Ahaz, king of Judah, Hoshea, the son of Elah, began to reign in Samaria, and he reigned over Israel for 9 years. Now, we know that it will syncretize Israel with Judah. Remember that they didn't have a hard BC date. So they couldn't say, well, in 730 BC, Hoshea did this. That system didn't exist. So the only thing they could do was they had to anchor their activities in terms of someone else's activities. And that's where you get the syncretism between the 12th year of Ahaz and the first year of Hoshea. And one of the things that would be a very interesting study to do would be to play back and forth. In other words, reading what's going on and understanding what's going on in Judah, and then understanding, did that influence what was going on in Israel and vice versa? We know that it did, just like, Steve, as you would well know, what happens in the United States influences Canada. Now we're seeing what's happening in Canada is in part influencing the United States. And Israel and Judah were so close together, it would be, it just wouldn't be historical to think that they didn't influence each other. For example, we all remember Ahab and Jezebel. Well, when Ahab was king of Israel, a godly king, Jehoshaphat, was king of Judah. Well, Jehoshaphat had a son named Jehoram. Well, Jehoram ended up marrying Ahab's daughter. And it's like, you got to be kidding me. Why in the world would he do that? And it's not explained. But then Jehoram did evil things in the eyes of Yahweh. And it's like, no kidding, because look who he was married to. Look who his father-in-law was, that kind of thing. So what do we know? I'm not going to go here, but we could go to 2 Kings chapter 16, and we could read about Ahaz. And Ahaz was a horrible king. In fact, he killed his children. He was one of the few kings of Judah who actually burned his children to pagan gods. That makes Hezekiah's life more profound, if you will, because, Hezekiah had brothers who were sacrificed to idols. And it's just the grace of God on Hezekiah's life that he wasn't sacrificed to idols as well. And of course, he grows up to be one of the great kings of Judah. So here's Hoshea, and he began to reign in Samaria, and he reigned over Israel for 9 years. Verse 2, he did what was evil in the eyes of Yahweh. No kidding. Israel had 20 kings between Jeroboam the first, who reigned in Israel after he came up and took over the 10 tribes right after Solomon died. So from Jeroboam the first until and including Hoshea, there are 20 kings of the northern country of Israel. and not one of them did good. Talk about a heritage of evil. 20 different kings, and every single one of them did evil in the eyes of Yahweh. That collective evil is like water behind a dam. So when we see the Hoshea here and the Assyrians and the carrying away the destruction of Israel, we can't just point fingers at Hoshea and see, it's your fault, it's your fault. He's got 20 evil kings behind him and over 200 years of people doing evil in the eyes of Yahweh. I believe that the United States of America is as blessed as we are because there have been so many generations of godly people. From the pilgrims that came over here, the Puritans that came over here, the founding fathers, the laws that they set up. By the way, the pilgrims, when they came over, they weren't reading the King James Bible, they were reading the Geneva Bible of 1599. It's actually a slightly better translation than the King James Version. But in any case, there was just so many generations of godly men and women, and we're seeing that slip away. And we have a chance, in fact, I think it was during the presidency of Obama, he said, the United States is not a Christian nation. We've always been a Christian nation. Our founding fathers were Christians. On our coins and dollar bills is "In God We Trust," and it didn't get there by mistake. So it's Christians that have to stand up and say, that's not true. We are a Christian nation. Maybe you're not Christian and you live here, but this nation is Christian. And it was founded on Christian principles. And I believe the reason that we're not just dust is because of the people that have stood for generations. And now it's your and my turn to stand in this generation, pray for this country, witness to people, read our Bibles, be as godly as we can so that we can influence this country. So he did that which was evil, it says in verse 2, in the eyes of Yahweh. Then it says, yet not like the kings of Israel who were before him. Okay, well, if he didn't do evil like the kings of Israel who were before him, because there were some of those evil practices that even Hoshea didn't participate in, then why couldn't he save his country? And the answer is, again, what I just said. There was such a downwash of evil, and he himself was evil, even though he wasn't as evil as some of the kings before him. And so we're going to see here Israel be destroyed. What we need to walk away, the mini lesson we want to walk away from in this is what we do counts, what our ancestors did counts, and what our enemies do counts against us, which is one of the important reasons that we don't want to fly beneath the radar. We want to stand up and speak up. And what did Christ say, Matthew 10:28? Don't be afraid of those who can kill the body, and after that, there's nothing else they can do. We need to stand up and speak up and be seen. So verse 3, Shalmaneser, king of Assyria, came up against him, and Hoshea became his servant and paid him tribute. And Assyria at this time in history, and especially as we'll see a little later in the chapter, they were the big dog on the block. Assyria was like maybe the United States of 15 years ago when Russia wasn't as strong, China wasn't as strong, and we were the big dog on the planet. And that's shifting, may have already shifted actually. And Assyria was huge, and little Israel was not huge. And so Assyria came up against him, and Hoshea saved his country by surrendering and paying tribute. There's another mini lesson here, and that is that that's not the way David saved his country. I really believe had Israel walked with Yahweh the way they were supposed to walk with Yahweh, they could fight off any army. Moses took a bunch of slaves and basically single-handedly delivered them from the most powerful nation on earth. If you notice when Moses delivered the children of Israel from Egypt, it wasn't a popular uprising. He didn't organize an army. He was godly. Israel's time had come. God stepped in and delivered the people. That's what you and I need in our country. That's what Hoshea needed, but he was evil and he didn't have the favor of Yahweh with him. So he came up, Hoshea became his servant and paid him tribute. Verse 4. But the king of Assyria found out Hoshea was in a conspiracy, for he had sent messengers to So, king of Egypt, we would say Pharaoh of Egypt, and did not send up tribute to the king of Assyria as he had done year after year. So the king of Assyria seized him and bound him in prison. And there's a lesson here about being overconfident. You know, Jesus Christ taught us, if you're going to build a tower, make sure you count your cost before you get started. If you're going to go out with an army, make sure you count up your army before you go out and get started, and make sure that you can move ahead. And Hoshea became overconfident. Again, we're not privy to the conversations he had with his top generals and the people from Egypt, but in any case, he thought he could trust Egypt to bail him out against the king of Assyria. But when push came to shove, the Egyptians didn't show up. And there's a mini lesson there for us, you know, in the words of Jesus Christ, that before you enter into an endeavor, you know, make sure that you've done your homework, that your ducks are in a row, that things are going to fall the way you want them to. So first of all, the king of Assyria got upset, you know, and it was a dead giveaway when you don't send tribute. You've been sending tribute every year, and then all of a sudden you don't. You know, the king of Assyria isn't going to put up with that too long before he's going to say, okay, what's going on? So he just came down and seized Hoshea, put him in prison. And then verse 5, since the king of Assyria was participating in like what we would call expansionist policies anyway, kind of what China's doing in the world today, taking this little territory and that little territory and kind of pushing the edge of the envelope. Assyria was very much doing that. You know, same, gosh, I tell you, if you know history, it just repeats itself over and over and over and over again. So the king of Assyria went up throughout all the land, that's the land of Israel, and went up to Samaria, and that is the capital city of the country of Israel, and also the capital city of the territory called Samaria. He went up to the capital city and besieged it for 3 years. And for those of you that have been on Bible Lands tours with me and we go to Samaria, the blasted thing is up on top of this giant mountain, and the sides are super steep. And they had water up there and huge thick walls and stuff. And here comes the strongest army in the world at that time that we know of, or at least certainly in the Middle East and what we know about Africa and Europe. And they were the strongest army that certainly was in that part of the world. And here's this little dinky city on a hilltop, and it took them 3 years to conquer it. And that's how well fortified it was. And talk about, you know, I think about just thousands of soldiers sitting around at the bottom of the hill trying different things to attack the city. You know, there would have been a lot of downtime, so to speak. So they besieged Samaria for 3 years. Verse 6, in the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria captured Samaria. Now there's an interesting historical twist here, because if you look at verse 3, it says Shalmaneser, king of Assyria, came up against him. So in verse 6, it just says, in the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria captured Samaria. Well, who's the king of Assyria? Well, normally we would think Shalmaneser. Interestingly enough, the very year that Samaria fell, Shalmaneser died, and his successor, Sargon, took over. Now, Sargon claims the victory in his Assyrian records, but historians aren't sure whether he actually was the one. He might have been the one to finish the battle, but he might not have been. He might have just came in and scooped things up after Shalmaneser died and claimed the victory. Can't be sure. But the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria captured Samaria and carried Israel away to Assyria and placed them in Hala and on the Habor, that's a river, the river of Gozan, which is a territory in Assyria, and in the city of the Medes, which is the kind of northwestern part, northeastern and eastern part of Assyria. Now, when you read the Old Testament and also when you read Middle Eastern history, what the Assyrians did here is incredibly common. I mean, the same Babylonians did the same thing. They come in, they capture a territory, they take the people away, they bring other people in. What's going on? Well, two things are happening. One is, and the primary thing is that the kings are, they know they only get money, taxation, and stuff. The Romans figured this out if there was peace. You can't have constant insurrections and be able to keep together a prosperous empire. So if you take people from their homeland and scatter them all apart, then you have much less chance of there being any kind of organized insurrection. And so that's part of the reason that time after time, when you study Middle Eastern history, they carried people away. The other thing you see, excuse me, is the Assyrians, the Babylonians, when they carry a country away, they generally put them on the outskirts of their empire. And part of that was to create buffer cities. So if there was an enemy that was coming through before they got to the real heartland of the country, they had to fight these outliers that really the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians didn't really even care about. But those outlying cities would help protect the country that was there. So that's what's going on there. He carried the Israel away to Assyria. And verse 7. Now this came about because the children of Israel had sinned against Yahweh their God. So here God makes it very clear. The reason for the defeat was sin. It wasn't because Assyria had such a blasted powerful army. You know, we learn when Assyria went down to get Hezekiah, the angel of the Lord entered in, killed 185,000 Assyrian soldiers in one night, and the Assyrian army went home. What was left of it, anyway. But these guys were conquered because they sinned against Yahweh their God, who had brought them up out of the land of Egypt from under the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and because they had feared other gods. So that sin and the worship of other gods had caused problems in their life. And you and I then look at our country, and one of the reasons that we want to speak up is because we see this is what happens to countries. Countries collapse when there's massive sin and when people turn to other gods. And that's one of the reasons that we want to stay faithful. Our presence makes a difference. Our godliness makes a difference. Our prayers make a difference. Our witnessing makes a difference. And we can turn people from darkness to light, and we can help people to stop sinning in their lives. And the devil has worked very hard to make sin easy. And it always becomes an interesting challenge when you're working with an individual. You know, there's such a difference between what you see in your mind's eye. Oh yeah, witnessing, counseling, pastoring somebody, under shepherding somebody. It sounds so glorious and it sounds so easy to actually try it. And then you find out people are messy and their lives are messy and they don't like to be challenged. And if somebody, for example, has, you know, these are my, you know, I'll make a great example, you know, prayer hands on a car dashboard. If they remind you to pray, great. If you're looking to them to save you from a car wreck, you've got an idol. And, you know, and it's so interesting because the only way you know in somebody's life whether the objects or the whatever it is in their life is an idol or not is if you get involved. And then if you get involved and the person says, I'm sure that I'd be in a lot of more car wrecks if I didn't have those prayer hands that saved me, then okay, you've got a choice. Are you going to enter into that conversation and tell them that God would really appreciate it if he got 100% of their worship? You know, part of the problem with the Trinity is that God says that he wants you to love him with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind, and all your strength. That's easy to do if there's only one God. But as soon as you get starting more gods and more objects of worship, then you're parsing, you're dividing up the worship that you can dedicate to God. And, you know, we have to help people understand this and help people see this. So these guys, they sinned and they feared other gods. Verse 8, they walked in the statutes of the nation that Yahweh drove out from before the children of Israel, and in the statutes of the king of Israel, which they had made. Now, we need to back up and read this verse slowly because there's a great mini lesson buried in here. It says these guys walked in the statutes of the nations that Yahweh drove out before the children of Israel. Okay, understood. They were sinning. They were idolaters. That caused consequence. But then he adds, and in the statutes of the kings of Israel, which they had made. Oh, so like when the kings of Israel made regulations and told the Israelites to worship in a certain way, like when I think it was Ahaz of Judah, who saw he saw the altar in Damascus when he was up there, and he brought that down and put it in the temple and moved God's altar, which had existed since the time of Solomon, and he moves that over and says, we're going to worship on this altar. And you've got this commandment that, like, for example, in Romans 13, where, you're supposed to follow your leaders and that kind of thing. But then Jesus Christ didn't. I mean, he did for the most part, but there were ungodly things that were demanded by the leadership in Christ's time, like do not heal on the Sabbath, and Christ just blatantly blew it off. And you get the apostles, they were commanded by their leadership not to witness, and they said, we must obey God rather than men. Here's a situation where the kings of Israel had put laws in place that were against God's laws. Okay, so here you are as a citizen. Do you obey the ungodly law of the king, or do you obey the law of God? And here it gives us a glimpse into this, because it says they decided to obey the laws of their kings. Verse 8, they walked in the statutes of the kings of Israel, which they had made. And as a result, they got carried away. So we see they made the decision not to obey God, to obey their king, and they got consequences as a result. And I think that it doesn't make life easy, but it makes paying attention to what's going on from the government very important. Just like the same thing with the apostles. They had to make a decision. Are we going to obey our leaders, or are we going to obey God? And here it is, we see people that, with the apostles, they defied the government. Here we see the people obeyed the government, but then they got really, really serious consequences from it, including death and being exiled from their own land. That was verse 8. Now there's another really super powerful lesson in verse 9, but you have to be reading the right version, because it says the children of Israel, this is verse 9, the REV, the children of Israel attributed words that were not so to Yahweh their God. And they built pagan shrines for themselves in all their cities, from watchtower to fortified city. I should go here and read this in a different version, just to show you what I want to talk to you about. Okay, if we go to the King James Version, for example, and there's a lot of versions I could go to, the King James Version says, and the children of Israel did secretly those things that were not right against the Lord their God. So you've got this word secretly in here, and there's a number of versions that go that way. Well, this Hebrew word that the King James translates secretly, that we in the REV have translated attributing or attributed, that word only occurs one time in the whole Hebrew Bible. And so forever, the scholars didn't know what it meant. And if you read the Brown Driver Briggs Hebrew lexicon, which I believe was done in 1904, they give the definition secretly. But then when you read the modern Hebrew lexicons like Holiday and like Halot, they use the word attributed or something along that line. and they define it differently. And what happened in the century of the 1900s, the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, Ugaritic was deciphered, a lot of things happened that redefined some of the different words. Now, you'd have a problem with secretly anyway, because the children of Israel didn't worship Yahweh. You know, they didn't, what's the King James say? They did secretly those things that were not right. No, they didn't. They did them completely openly. The problem was they just didn't know what the word meant in 1611. But there's no indication anywhere else in the text that the sin of the Israelites was secret. In fact, part of the problem was it was all out in the open. So then when we get this right and understand what's really going on here, there's a super powerful lesson. Excuse me for coughing. I don't know what's going on in my throat here. So let's read verse 9 again. The children of Israel attributed words, the Hebrew is dabar, which can be words, things, or matters. It's kind of tough to translate that then in English, because the Hebrew congeals all three meanings into one. Maybe we might say something like, the children of Israel attributed stuff that wasn't true to Yahweh. just stuff, things that were said, things that were done, things that Yahweh was involved with. And God is not happy with that. And he says, you know, and then they built shrines and whatever. And this is a trick of the devil. And it's so true in our world, you know, that you start looking at what religion teaches, what are the embedded traditions that have been around Christian religion forever, like you're going to burn in hell forever if you sin, and that kind of thing. And the devil, as he's inculcated himself into various religious practices, has changed what people believe from the truth to other things. And then people attribute to God things that he didn't say, things that he didn't do, things that he wasn't involved with. And they attribute that to God. And this is an ancient trick of the devil. And he does it here. And I'll show you somewhere else it appears that you're going to be surprised with. And the reason I know you're going to be surprised with it is I was surprised with it. So let's go to Exodus chapter 20. In Exodus chapter 20, we have the 10 commandments. And the very first commandment, Exodus chapter 23, I am the God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. Verse 3, you must not have any other gods besides me. In other words, I want to be your one and only God. Excuse me. The word translated me is panim, face. And the word besides, this is the Hebrew preposition al, which means a whole bunch of things. And so al pane or whatever basically is, you can say, there's just a lot of different ways you can translate it. You must not have any other gods beside me. You must not have any other gods before my face. Gosh, I'm so sorry. Or you can even translate it, you must not have any other gods upon my face. And granted, that is not a primary meaning of the text here, but it is a possible reading of the text and what I would call kind of a background meaning or shadow meaning, that God doesn't want to see any other gods around him. You're not to have any other gods beside him, and you shouldn't have any other gods upon his face. Like, for example, you're looking at God with a mask. So we put together this God, and then we claim it to be Yahweh. And of course, that's what the children of Israel did. The children of Israel ascribed all kinds of things to Yahweh that he didn't do. So, and that's kind of buried in here in Exodus chapter 20, as well as being stated in 2 Kings chapter 17. So now back to 2 Kings chapter 17:9. So the children of Israel attributed words that were not so to Yahweh their God, and they built pagan shrines for themselves in all their cities, from the watchtower to the fortified city. And they set up for themselves standing stones and Asherah poles on every high hill and under every green tree. And they burned incense at all the shrines, like the nations that Yahweh had driven out from before them. Now, I want to talk about the shrines for a second, because that has been, even by me, I've only learned this within the last 6 months or so. But all the shrines, the Hebrew word is bemot for shrines. And it means, it's kind of literally like high place or elevated place. And because of that, a lot of the versions are going to read, they burned incense, at all the high places like the nations did. And for most of my 50 years of my Christian life, I believe that what happened was there were high places, elevated places, hilltops and such outside the cities, and people went there and burned incense on those hilltops. And it was in translating the Old Testament with Bill that he said, that's not what happened. And I was like, really? That's not what happened? That's what I believed for decades. What do you mean that's not what happened? And he explained, and then I did the research behind it. The word bemot is a high place in the sense that when the children of Israel wanted to worship a pagan god, they would clear a spot. And generally speaking, this was done in the middle of their city. And then they would raise that up a little bit, bring in the dirt and smooth it out, so that it was, you approached it and you walk up a couple feet. And he said, it may even be like in the case of Shechem, which we call Sichem, that that it's actually, it's down in this little low-lying valley type area. So it's actually lower than the hills around it. But why is it called a high place? Because the people come and they build up a little dirt pile and they smooth it all out on the top, and then they stick their various gods on it. So it was called a high place because it was elevated up a little bit above the area immediately around it, not because it was out on a hillside. And so what was it? It was a shrine. If we understand that, once I understood that, then a whole bunch of verses made sense that never made sense before. Keep your Bible here, however you do it, and go to 1 Kings chapter 3, verse 2. Yeah, that's one of them. Let's go to 2 Kings chapter 12. That might be better. 2 Kings chapter 12 and verse 3. Oh yeah, that's what I wanted. So here's Jehu. Jehu gets rid of the altars. Jehoash is altars of Baal and the Baal worshipers. Jehoash is the king of Judah. He reigns 40 years. Verse 2, Joash did what was right in the eyes of Yahweh. Did what was right in the eyes of Yahweh all his days, in which Jehoiada the priest instructed him. Verse 3, only the local shrines were not taken away. The people were still sacrificing and burning incense at the shrines. I read this for years as only the high places were not taken away. And I never could figure out why don't the people go out and tear down the high places? And the answer is they're not outside the city and they're not on top of a hill. They're just a little flat area that's built up a little bit right in the heart of the city. And the people are very committed to them. It's like my grandfather helped build that place. And these little idols have been around a long time and they aren't hurting anybody, are they? And so the reason that even good kings who did what was right in the eyes of Yahweh couldn't get rid of the local shrines was because they were so beloved by the people. And when you understand that, then you understand why there's so many kings of Judah that it'll say they did that was right, but they didn't take away the local shrines. They did which was right before Yahweh, but they didn't take away the local shrines. And then you got a king like, I think it was Josiah, who did take away the local shrines, but then with the next king, they're back. And you're like, how can they come back so fast? Because they were beloved by the people and the people built them back. And so once we understand that, there's a lot of verses that that come together. So we're back to 2 Kings chapter 11. So the Israelites are burning incense at all the shrines like the nations did that Yahweh had driven out from before them, and they did evil things, making Yahweh angry. And verse 12, and they served the disgusting idols about which Yahweh said to them, you must not do this thing. And notice that the word disgusting, if you're reading the REV, is in italics. And that's something that we're wrestling with right now, because the Old Testament has about 5 different Hebrew words for idol. And in almost every version and the REV up until now, it's all 5 words get translated idol because all 5 words mean idol. But they each have their own nuance. Like in this case, the word idol, very possibly it comes from the root word dung. So it's an idol, but it's talked about in a very, very pejorative way. It's just dung. They worship these dung things. Now, there's other possibilities for the Hebrew word root as well, but dung is a very distinct possibility. Then one of the Hebrew words that gets translated idols is nothings. You know, that they're nothings. It gets translated idols, but it really makes the point that they're just nothing. They're not powerful. They're not valuable. They're just nothing. But it gets translated idol because they're nothings. And then there's another Hebrew word that gets translated idol that comes from the word worthless. And you could translate it maybe worthlessnesses, that the people the people worshipped worthlessnesses. So these little distinctions are important, and it's difficult to try to find out how to translate them into text without making the text this giant long thing. But in any case, verse 12, they served the disgusting idols about which Yahweh had said to them, you must not do this thing. Verse 13, yet Yahweh warned Israel and Judah by the hand of every prophet and every seer, saying, turn from your evil ways and keep my commandments and my statutes in accordance with all the law that I commanded your fathers that I sent to you by the hand of my servants, the prophets. In the mini lesson that I got out of verse 13, Yahweh warned Israel and Judah by the hand of every prophet and every seer. God was working so hard to bring the people back to himself, every prophet and every seer. And those prophets and seers were not successful. I mean, you look at the history of Israel, 200 years, not one king is a godly king. The prophets and seers may have been helpful in turning some individuals from darkness to light, but they weren't successful in changing the trajectory of the kingdom. And they almost all got in trouble. They were persecuted, they were beaten, they were whipped, they were tortured, they were killed. And once again, we see that what Paul wrote in Timothy about all those who live godly will suffer persecution. We see it all through the Old Testament too. And as an outsider reading into the text, what's happening inside of me is I'm fortified in my mind, say, I'm not any better than these guys. I don't know why I would expect to be able to witness boldly and not get any persecution or junk from the outside world when that hasn't been the way it's been historically. And then you fortify your mind. Okay, God, I'm ready to enter into the fight. And that's what Paul writes on his deathbed. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. You know, he didn't say I avoided the fight. I fought the good fight. And that's where we've got to show up too. And these prophets and seers spoke up for God, stood up for God, and took it on the chin for God. And of course, they will be greatly rewarded. Verse 14, we see the result of their work, but the people wouldn't listen. They stiffened their neck like the neck of their fathers who did not trust in Yahweh their God. They rejected his statutes and covenants that he cut with their fathers, and particularly this would refer to the old covenant that the Israelites cut with God on Mount Sinai in Exodus 24, and his warnings with which he warned them, and they followed. And this is cool. Here's the word worthless referring to idols. He followed after worthless idols. Note idols is in italics. Why? Because it's worthlessnesses. So from God's perspective, the idols are just worthlessnesses. And then it says very clearly in the text, and became worthless. If a person in the Old Testament turns away from God and follows those who are worthless, the person becomes worthless. Now, these are the words of God. This is when I say this teaching is tough in some points. This is the word, these are the words of God. We don't like looking at somebody and saying you're worthless. In fact, the devil has a really aggressive agenda out there that everybody's important, everybody's valuable, God loves everybody, that kind of thing. That is not the testimony of the text itself. Here we're reading the word of God, and it says these people became worthless. And how does that play out in history? Well, Jesus Christ in Matthew chapter 5, and you can start reading in verses like Matthew chapter 5, verse 22, where Christ talked about, if you don't follow God, then you position yourself to be thrown into Gehenna. Well, the Hebrew word geh is valley, and Hinnom was the man's name. Gehenna was in Hebrew the valley of Hinnom. You'll be thrown into the valley of Hinnom. What was happening in the valley of Hinnom? Well, that was where all the garbage was thrown, and it was burned up. And what do you do with worthless things? You throw them out. You put them in the garbage and you burn them up. And that's exactly what's going to happen to people that don't get saved. And this then becomes a real important call to you and I, because if we love others, if we care about others, then we don't want to see that happen to people. We want to make sure that people have a choice. And that's one of the reasons that we witness so hard. We don't want people to be thought of as worthless and thrown into Gehenna. And so we speak up, and we've got to be honest about this thing, because it doesn't help to tell somebody whose God values as worthless because they didn't get saved, they don't like God, they hate the things of God, they have changed his principles and his rules, they refuse to live by the natural order that he has set up, and they want to think that they're valuable. Guys, here it is in black and white. They became worthless. And somebody needs to tell them that they're in danger. And that's on you and I. And it's not fun. And not that you have to march up to somebody and say you're worthless, but you guys know what I mean when you walk up to somebody and you help them to see, how they can actually change from being worthless to being valuable. I mean, that's a lot of what we do in witnessing, is we do that kind of thing. And then it goes on, says they followed the nations that were around them, concerning whom Yahweh had commanded them that they were not to do like them. And then it says they forsook all the commandments of Yahweh their God, and made cast metal images for themselves, 2 calves, and made an Asherah, and worshipped all the army of heaven, and served Baal. By the way, many times in the Old Testament text, the stars, sun, planets are called the army of heaven. And the reason for that is the natural order. It was and you guys know when you look up at the sky and you see the brilliant stars on a clear night and how the constellations look, and there's an order to it. And of course, they were aware of the orderly movement of the planets, the orderly movement of the sun, the orderly movement of the moon. And so they thought of the stars and planets. Of course, they didn't know they were planets, but they thought of them as being like an army, an orderly army under the command of God that would march around the way they were supposed to march around. And that's why you get the saying, the army of heaven. Verse 17, again, going back to how ungodly Israel had become. They made their sons and daughters pass through the fire, used divination, interpreted omens, and sold themselves to do which was evil. Sold themselves to do what was evil is a an idiom for they were committed to it. You know, they just didn't stumble, bumble, and fumble into evil. They were committed to doing what they were doing, even though they knew that God had not commanded. Verse 18, therefore Yahweh became very angry with Israel, and he removed them from his presence. None was left but the tribe of Judah alone. And there's the carrying away of the 10 northern tribes. Israel gets carried away. Verse 19, also Judah did not keep the commandments of Yahweh their God, but walked in the practices that Israel did. And yet Judah, thankfully, had a whole series of godly kings, like Jehoshaphat, like Hezekiah, like, Uzziah for most of his life, like Josiah. Well, I said Josiah, but they had godly kings, which helped keep their kingdom godly. Verse 20, so Yahweh rejected all the seed of Israel and afflicted them and gave them into the hand of plunderers until he had cast them out of his presence. Verse 21, for he had torn Israel from the house of David, and they made Jeroboam the son of Nebat king. He was Jeroboam the first. He was the guy that started to reign right after Solomon died, and he set up golden calves, one in Bethel and one in Dan. Jeroboam drove Israel from following after Yahweh and made them sin a great sin because he introduced tremendous idolatry in Israel. Verse 22, so the children of Israel walked in all the sins of Jeroboam that he did. They didn't depart from it until Yahweh removed Israel from his presence, as he had spoken by all his servants, the prophets. So Israel was exiled from their own land to Assyria to this day. And that was the end of Israel and the 10 northern tribes. And now we wait for them to be regathered after Jesus Christ rules the earth. And then the last part of the chapter is about how the Assyrians brought in pagans and put them in Samaria. And there's some great lessons in there too, but I think we've gone long enough for, to get some great lessons and see kind of the flow of history. So thank you so much for being with me. This is really great to learn this stuff, to see this stuff, to get these lessons, and to just see what God is teaching us and expressing to us in his word. So thanks again for being with me, and we'll just open the floor for what you guys want to share, where you want to go, comments and ideas and stuff like that.